Continuing our reading of Major Robert Crisp's Brazen Chariots, the Ballantine 1961 paperback. Fourth day, page 36. In the cold dark of the pre-dawn, my troop moved out of lager, hungry, sleepy, dirty, unenthusiastic. I munched miserably at a hard biscuit plastered with marmalade, passed up to me from inside the turret where the crew were having their breakfast. The tanks edged forward slowly. In each vehicle the scene would be the same. The driver, hands at the ready on the steering sticks and foot poised sensitively on the throttle, would be peering intently at the narrow world confined by the slit in the armor plating in front of him. The operator would be fiddling about with the wireless set and checking the ammunition and the AP shells for the 37 millimeter. The gunner would be settling himself comfortably, testing the traverse and the ammunition belts, squinting through his telescopic sights at the rounded zero of desert beyond. Each tank commander, standing upright in the turret or perched on top with legs dangling inside, would be pushing his vision to the utmost distance to pick up shape or movement, the constant earphones in position and the mic on his chest to maintain his link with the rest of the regiment and with the crew below. The light stole softly across the desert from the east, and as it drifted ahead, it suddenly lit up a dense column of transport, moving at a good pace across our front to the northwest. We must have spotted each other simultaneously, as the head of the column suddenly wheeled sharply to the west and made off fast enough to prevent us getting any guns into action. A brisk battle developed over on the extreme right, and in mid-morning, C Squadron was moved across to reinforce the other squadrons which were under pressure. On the way past HQ, I had a quick word with Dr. McMillan, our M.O., who told me that Peter Williams had been killed. Peter had been second in command of B Squadron and had got an MC at Calais in the evacuation of France. He was the first officer fatality in 3RTR, and somehow his death subtly altered the outlook for everybody. A few minutes later, I passed Williams' tank where it had been knocked out and realized with a shock that, although it was facing north towards the enemy, the shell which had knocked out the tank and which had killed him had penetrated the back of the turret. I wondered how many people in the war had been and would be killed by their own side's bullets, shells, and bombs. Identification in the confused, swift-moving desert war was always difficult, and was made more so by encounters that took place so often in the indeterminate light of dawn or dusk, and by the paucity of information available about the movements of either force. It was a confused day of constant skirmishing with enemy forces which seemed to occupy all the desert to the north. I had several duels with enemy tanks, knocked out two, and learnt a great deal. I learnt which of their armored fighting vehicles I could take on and beat with the honey, and which of them I had to avoid until I could create a favorable situation for myself. We were always prepared to take on any number of Italian tanks, for instance, and any of the German Mark IIs and armored cars. The Marks III and IV, however, had to be dealt with by subterfuge and the grace of God rather than by superior fighting qualities. It was on this occasion that I actually saw two AP shells coming towards me before they hit my tank. I had picked out a couple of Mark II tanks that had swanned out from the main convoy, as was their habit under threat of attack, and I was making my way towards them, using the ground as well as I could to get within the 600 yards that I had already decided was the absolute maximum effective range of the 37 millimeter. They could see me, of course, and knew what I was up to. Suddenly I saw the puff of smoke from one of them, and in the same split second I glimpsed a black object whishing through the air at me. It was followed immediately by another shot from the second tank, and exactly the same thing happened. I watched both shells pitch into the sand about 10 yards in front of the tank and ricochet onto the armor with a devil of a clang. It was an invaluable lesson to me. I had noticed the quick curvature of the shells and knew that at that distance, not above 1,000 yards, the Mark IIs could do me no damage. More important, I knew that in those German tanks were some very windy soldiers, much more windy than I was. That day, I believe, we shed our light-heartedness and eagerness. The sense of adventure had gone out of our lives, to be replaced by grimness and fear and a perpetual mounting weariness of body and spirit. In the evening, we were ordered to take up positions for an attack in force on another big enemy column that could be seen moving to the northwest. Tired and a little unwilling, we waited for the command that would set us off. The light failed before it came. Instead, we pulled back into lager in the darkness and counted the rising toll of battle. The events of that day and the change in the course of the whole campaign had been determined the previous night by Rommel, who had issued orders to his two panzer divisions, 15th and 21st, to get together and, quote, attack and destroy the enemy force which has advanced on Tobruk. The objective, added Rommel's order, is the center airfield at Sidi Rezek. Fifth day. In the middle of the night, the troop leaders were dragged out of their sleep to go to the CO's tank, where, under a carefully shaded torch, we were shown the plans for an attack with the Royal Horse Artillery Battery on an enemy lager at dawn. We went back to our hard beds, muttering and grumbling. I had always favored a full-scale night attack on a German lager for the simple reason that I couldn't think of anything worse happening to us, but I didn't particularly want to get mixed up in this one. I was too damn sleepy for a start. At 4 o'clock, we were up and moving into the night, and within half an hour all the lightly armored towing vehicles of the RHA, known as quads, had got bogged down in a swamp which had survived from the last heavy rains. By the time we reached the scene of the intended assault, all that was left of the enemy lager were the track marks in the sand. To compensate for this disappointment, we carried out a vicious little assault on a cluster of enemy vehicles, all of which proved to be derelict. This was not an altogether unusual occurrence. Movement from lager started, of necessity, with visibility at a minimum, and practically anything could happen in that first hour before the sun lit up the desert. This same sort of thing happened in the last hour of light. In between these dim-lit hours, the nature of the terrain and atmosphere gave rise to all kinds of queer distortions, so that bushes looked like tanks and tanks looked like rows of trees, and a herd of camels grazing peacefully in the distance could fill the air with urgent signals about enemy tank concentrations, signals which could go from troop to regiment to brigade, the resulting flap penetrating right back to Army headquarters. My own tank must have covered many scores of miles, literally, in pursuit of mirages. It was an inauspicious start to the day, and it maintained its character throughout the morning when we set off on 3 separate swans, which turned out to be wild goose chases. Time was so full of purposeless movement that we were unable even to make a brew. At 1:30 in the afternoon, an order was given for the whole regiment to move on a bearing of 283 degrees, C Squadron leading. That meant me, and I was wondering how long it would be before the orders were canceled and replaced by another bearing when I heard the CO say, "Friends like us are being heavily attacked. They need our help. We must move quickly." At this stage of the fighting, so many tanks had broken down or had been knocked out that no squadron was at full strength, and troop organization was on a very makeshift basis. My own troop consisted of only 2 honeys, and I had an officer, Tom Enyon, on the other tank acting as troop sergeant. I lined up my tank on 283 degrees, and the 2 of us set off at a good pace into the empty desert westwards. We were soon miles ahead of the rest of the battalion, and I was beginning to think that this was just another false alarm when, ahead of me, I saw the telltale columns of black smoke, like treacle rising on the horizon. Behind me, as I looked back, I could see the moving dots of the other tanks, and behind them, I knew, were the other 2 tank regiments of 4th Armored Brigade, mustering about 100 all told, instead of the full quota of 160. Through the wireless, I got in touch with the CO, who sounded faint and distant, to try to get information about where exactly we were going and what I could expect to find when I got there. He could tell me nothing beyond the compass bearing. I decided not to wait for reinforcements to come up, but to press on as fast as possible and get some real information that would be of value to the commanders behind me. I looked over at Tom, who had heard the conversation and who made a despairing gesture with both hands out of the top of the turret. I gave my driver the order to advance and told the crew to get ready for practically anything. The compass was no longer necessary with that grim beacon to guide us. Operation Crusader was now approaching its dreadful and fateful climax. That bearing of 283 degrees was not just a line drawn on the desert floor. It was pointed straight at the airfield of Sidi Rezek. The position, briefly, on that Saturday morning was that light British forces, infantry, guns, and tanks of the 17th Armored Brigade and Support Group were in occupation of the airfield and a good portion of the escarpments which flanked it north and south. Their objective was to link up with the sortie from Tobruk, which had already started. 22nd Armored Brigade were still to the south, and 4th Armored were, as I have just described them. The German armored divisions had started their advance from the southeast to carry out Rommel's instructions to destroy the enemy forces at Sidi Rezek. I altered course slightly north so that my tank was pointing straight at the tall columns of doom. Towards the west there were some lonely-looking vehicles perched on the rim of the horizon, and soon as we sped on I could pick out long lines and clusters of transports scattered all over the desert to my left. But there was nothing to prepare me for the astonishing sight that greeted me as, quite suddenly, I came onto the edge of a long escarpment which dipped down under the very tracks of my tanks. 30 yards away on my right, I saw Tom's Honey come to a quick halt, and then his voice came incredulous over the air. "Bob, what the hell is all this?" Straight ahead and below in the middle distance lay the square, clean pattern of a desert airfield, its boundaries marked by neat lines of wrecked German and Italian fighter planes, its center littered with limp and shattered tanks, some of which had smoke rising black into the blue sky. On my left, the desert stretched away, covered with thin-skinned vehicles, but strangely empty of human movement. On my right and between our two tanks and the landing ground, the slope and bottom of the escarpment was crawling with the dark figures of men digging slit trenches, putting down mines, clustered around anti-tank and field guns, or, unbelievably, cooking a meal. On the other side of the depression, the opposite escarpment was full of men, less active than those below, and every now and again I saw the flash of gunfire. Neither Tom nor I could tell whether any of the men, vehicles, or guns were enemy or friendly. The only positive identification we had were the tanks on the airfield. All the burning ones were British Crusaders. There was no sign at all behind me of the rest of the battalion, but I just managed to raise the CO very faint and far away. I told him roughly where I was and described the fantastic scene below me. "I don't know whether they are enemy or friends," I ended. "Can you tell me what is supposed to be here?" He told me to wait while he consulted brigade. In a minute or two, back came his surprising reply: treat anything you see as enemy." I was looking across at Tom as the CO spoke, and even at 30 yards I could see the reaction of amazement on his face as he heard the message. We were perched on the edge of the escarpment in full view of the massed forces about 600 yards below. I could see them looking at us, but nobody paid much attention. I had come to the conclusion that they must be our own troops, but I could not be positive, and that last bit of information didn't help much. I was quite certain that the people on the other escarpment were enemy, and I was actually able to watch the gunfire and the burst of the shells in the depression below me. Whatever it was a situation that did not seem possible in a battle. I was nearly going crazy in trying to identify something and trying to determine where the enemy began and ended, and all the time asking the CO for information which he could not give me. I told Tom that I was quite sure that the enemy dug in about 2,000 yards away to the north, word Jerry, and that I was going to engage them with the machine gun. I had already given the gunner the order: "Browning, traverse right, on 2,000, enemy infantry," when I heard somebody shouting and banging on the side of the tank. I looked down at a little open tourer that had pulled up alongside and found myself staring at the 3 pips and crown of a tall, lean brigadier who was standing up on the front seat. I took the earphones off to hear him ask, "Are you in command here?" I looked again at his shoulder just to make sure and said, "I'm in command of this troop, sir." "What unit are you with?" "3rd RTR, 4th Armored Brigade." "Good. There's a Jerry tank attack coming in from the west. We need you. Follow me." I said desperately, "Sir, if you wait 10 minutes, the whole brigade will be up." "If you're there in 10 minutes, you'll be in time. If you're there in 15, you'll be too late," said the long brigadier. "Follow me." He sat down, said something to the fair-haired driver sitting capless beside him, and shot off down the escarpment. I told my driver to follow the car, and we bounced down. Over my shoulder I could see Tom's tank lurching down behind. On the way I explained as well as I could what had happened to my CO, that at that moment I was hurtling towards an airfield on which there were a lot of knocked-out tanks, and that if he got there in 10 minutes, he'd be in time, and if he got there in 15 minutes, he'd be too late. I said that as near as I could judge, I was just east of point 176 on the map, and that anything he saw between him and the airfield was friendly. I could do no more, and was very relieved to hear the distant acknowledgment. By this time, we were down the slope and in amongst the infantry and gunners. They were our own, all right. The grimy, weary men looked up hopefully as we passed, and I could see them yelling and giving the big thumbs-up signs. We went through and beyond them in a cloud of dust, 20, 25, 30 miles an hour, until the bounding tank, bucking the ridges and bushes and trenches, stretched out on the sudden smoothness of the landing ground with its crumpled plains. 30 yards ahead of me raced the little car, the blond head of the driver gleaming like the plumed helm of Navarre. Beside the driver sat the brigadier, holding aloft a blue and white flag that stood straight out in the gale of their going. No wonder the dispirited troops cheered. It must have been quite a sight. Straight across the airfield we hurtled towards the dipping sun. I hadn't the faintest idea where we were going, nor why. I was following 3 pips in a crown and a stiff blue and white flag. Now we were amongst the still burning, depressing-looking crusaders, and left them behind to speed through a few knocked-out jerry tanks, a much pleasanter sight. Then we were through these on to the clean desert floor. Suddenly the shells rained down, and the flat surface was transformed into fountains of red and yellow earth and flying stones and lead, through which the little car weaved and dodged and sometimes disappeared altogether in cascades of evil-smelling dirt and smoke. Miraculously it tore on, and the arm that held the lofted flag never wavered. At last, on the opposite edge of the airfield, where the scrub grew again in a straight line, the car halted, and my driver pulled back on the brakes. The long brigadier stood up, looked back at me, and then waved his arm widely to the westward. In the same gesture, the car revved up, doubled back, and like a coursing hare, disappeared erratically through the shell bursts. I looked ahead to where the brigadier had swung his arm. My stomach turned over. 1,200 yards ahead of me stretched the array of dark brown shapes, 60 or 70 monsters in solid line abreast, coming steadily towards the landing ground, towards me. The vicious flashes at the end of their gun muzzles stood out in fearful contrast against their somber camouflage. Behind them the sky was red with blood. I didn't need binoculars to pick out the Mark IIIs and Mark IVs. In between moved the infantrymen, and I caught the crackle of machine gun fire. I picked up the mic to speak to the gunner. "Cannon, 1200. You see all those things coming towards you? They're jerry tanks. Pick one out and stay on it till you knock it out. Get cracking." I heard the first shot go off almost immediately, and watched the tracer sail in a long, shallow curve. It hit on one of those dark silhouettes and bounced high into the air. We were much too far out of range to do any great damage, but I had to do something, and we were well within their range. I kept my gun going more in hope than expectation. Anyway, it was good for morale. We couldn't just sit there. My own feeling of nakedness and exposure was complete. There wasn't a bush more than 2 feet high anywhere to provide even the illusion of concealment. I looked round wildly for any kind of undulation that would give me even an imaginary protection, but the only unevenness on all that level plain was the churned-up sand of earlier tank tracks. In the event, it was probably my immobility which saved me. Over on my right, I suddenly saw Tom's Honey coming flat out across the landing ground. He came up almost abreast of me and was about 100 yards off when suddenly, still at top speed, his tank gave a great swerve and, slewing up sand as a speedboat splashes water, wheeled completely round and vanished somewhere among the derelict tanks. It was those knocked-out tanks which, I believe, saved me. The German tank gunners could not have been able to distinguish whether they were derelict or in action, and it is very unlikely that they would have expected to be confronted with one solitary Honey. I looked quickly over my shoulder, expecting to see the depression full of the charging, pennonted tanks of the whole 4th Armored Brigade. My spirits dropped when I realized that on that whole vast airfield not a thing was moving. The red fountains were playing all around me now. My mouth was filled with the acrid taste of cordite, and my nose could sense that frightful smell of impending death that goes with it. The air was full of lead and noise, and the tanks crept towards me with their guns belching. Mingled with the detonations of the HE and my own cannon, I could hear that terrifying swish of armor-piercing shell, and sometimes get a split-second glimpse of a tracer going by, taking the breath out of my lungs with the vacuum of its passage. Every now and again my honey would give that quick lurch, which meant a hit. I heard my gunner yell, "I've got one, sir!" And it sounded good to hear his elation, and to see the slow smoke curling up from the Mark III and the men bail out. The gunner was all right. He was picking his targets with an occasional word from me as I watched the tracer searing towards its target. "Keep on that big bastard that you've just hit until you stop him." The loader was all right, too. He would be too busy to be scared, tugging the next shell out of its bracket, pulling down the ejection lever, whipping in a new shell with enough force to close the breech, bending under to tap the gunner in the gun-ready signal, and then starting all over again as he heard the shot and saw the recoil next to his face. Anyway, he couldn't see what I could see, and the gunner could only see a small part of it. The driver was the chap I felt sorry for. He would be squeezed back and to one side, getting as far away from his driving aperture as possible, inactive and frightened to death, staring at that advancing line of tanks with an awful fascination, wondering when the shell would strike that would carve his body into little pieces, sensing the still running engine through his feet and hands. I noticed the engine, too, the sweet music of the radial in between all the other sounds, and the little rocking movements that were sometimes a strike and sometimes the recoil of my own cannon. I was still on the air to my CO. "Hello, Jago. Jago 1 calling. 70 enemy tanks approaching western edge of airfield. Am engaging at 1,000 yards. Jago 1 to Jago. Over." I was blurting my message into the frantic signals which were jamming the regimental frequency, hoping that somebody would hear me. I never got an acknowledgement. The arbitrary business we make of time crumbles into nothingness or infinity on occasions like that. I have no means of knowing how long we were on the edge of the airfield of Sidi Rezek. 5 minutes? 20 minutes? Whatever it was, there came a time when it was long enough. I had a last despairing search behind me for some sign of rescue and support, and then I decided to go. The line of tanks ahead of me was only about 800 yards away, but I could see the shell bursts where our own 25-pounders were beginning to go into action. The line seemed to be slowing down a bit, as though it did not know quite what to do, and was awaiting some decisive order. It seemed the psychological moment to make my departure. I said as quietly as I could into the mic, "Gunner, cease fire. Driver, advance. Turn about. Go like hell." That driver advance was the critical moment. It was always the same after a slugging match with the enemy, that frantic second of time when you did not know whether the tank would move or not. Even if the engine is still running, the suspension may be blasted into a state of collapse. Either of the tracks may be lying on the sand in mangled pieces. Any of those sickening lurches might have meant the end of your last hope, mobility. On the edge of the landing ground, I held my breath and felt the tank heave as the gears engaged. Then the engine seemed to rev high with relief, and the tank moved forward. This was another critical period. As soon as the tank moved, I knew that the eyes of every gunner in those panzers would be attracted to me. If the engine stalled now, I had had it. In fact, there was a good chance of that, whatever happened, but I was quite sure that once I could get up speed, I would be able to get away. We got round the turnabout without disaster, and soon we were speeding back across the airfield, jinking left and right, creating our own smoke screen of dust, dodging into the smoke of the shell bursts, all of which, as I had anticipated, now seemed to be aimed at me personally. Driver right, steady. Driver left, steady. Driver right, steady. So we fled back running that incredible gauntlet of death, each second beckoning us to safety. When we reached the lee of the derelict tanks, we were more or less safe from AP shells, and I knew we had made it. Halfway back across the landing ground, I felt safe enough to slow down and consider the situation. There was still a battle to be fought, and I did not want to fight it alone. The rest of the brigade must be somewhere. I halted the tank while I surveyed the scene through my binoculars. Behind me, the panzers appeared to have come to an uncertain stop some hundreds of yards from the airfield. The sun was disappearing over the high ground to the west, and there would not be more than a half-hour's light and fighting light left of the day. Feeling more reassured, I turned my attention to the southeast, from where I expected to see the honeys of 3 RTRs streaming down the escarpment. All I could see was a vast and swirling cloud of dust, and going round and round inside it in circles and figures of 8, I could dimly pick out the familiar shapes of British tanks. The battalion frequency was a bedlam of orders and counter-orders and frantic calls for information. For a few precious seconds, I managed to get the CO on the air and heard him order everybody else to shut up so that I can talk to Bob. I didn't go into details, but told him that there were about 70 Jerry tanks approaching the airfield from the west. He should get all tanks lined up on the eastern edge of the landing ground facing west. He would find me there. His reply was very much to the point. From somewhere in the middle of the tank-manufactured dust storm, he said, "I don't know my arse from my elbow, let alone east from west." But I heard him pass the instructions on to the squadrons, telling them to line up on my tank. I saw several tanks come out of the dust and mill about blindly. 2 of them fell into an anti-tank ditch, and through my glasses I could see one lying on its side with the upper track whirling madly. It was a hopeless shambles, and after a depressing few minutes I heard the CO order all tanks to rally on top of the escarpment. I can't say that I wasn't very relieved at this development. The panzers were on the move again, looking even more monstrous in the reflected red of the sky as they surged slowly towards the landing ground and the southern escarpment. Our honey was coming under direct fire again, so we wasted no time in obeying the latest order. But something was wrong. The tank was behaving in a very peculiar manner. Then I smelt the smoke. Quickly I looked down into the turret. The white, questioning faces of the gunner and operator stared back at me, and their lips formed the word fire. I looked back at the engine and saw the ominous fumes pouring out of the louvers. Just then the honey stopped. I yelled at the crew to bail out, and as we jumped down to the sand, we grabbed what we could off the hot armor plating above the engine. Bedding, grub, water bottles, cooking utensils. We ran back through the shell bursts and straggled wearily through the confusion and the gathering night up the side of the escarpment. The first person I saw was Harry McGrath. He also was climbing the escarpment with his crew. It was his tank which I had seen toppling sideways into the ditch. I pointed back to the airfield where a fresh, dense column of smoke was rising high above the others. "That's our honey," I said, and told him quickly what had happened. "But what the hell happened to everybody?" "You've never seen such a balls-up. We got to the edge of the escarpment all right, and then nobody knew where to go or what to do. We were told to advance on to the airfield and to line up on you facing west. Then 5th tanks got mixed up with us, and between us we kicked up such a hell of a lot of dust that we couldn't see 10 yards in any direction. We just went round and round each other in circles. I don't think any of our tanks went into action." Talking and panting, we reached the top of the escarpment, and soon we picked up a little cluster of honeys with their yellow pennants fluttering idly in the dirt-filled air. To our relief, we recognized our CO, perched on the turret, earphones on the mic, pressed to his lips. When he saw us walking up, he handed over to his operator and jumped down. "Am I glad to see you," he said. "The whole blasted battalion's disappeared. We've got my own tank and these 3 others. That's the lot. I've got some of them on the air, but they haven't the faintest idea where they are or where we are. What happened to you 2? His eyes grew wide with astonishment as he listened to my sketchy story. I was telling him about Tom Einen and asking him whether Tom had contacted him when a honey drew up alongside us, and from it clambered the familiar black-overalled figure of Brigadier Gatehouse. He told us quite calmly that his headquarters had been overrun by a Jerry tank column and that he wanted some tanks to go with him and get it back. I have never been more grateful to have been knocked out. Nothing could shake Alec Gatehouse out of that rock-like imperturbability. He showed no surprise when he was told that third tanks could muster only 4 honeys. "Then I'll go and get some of Dinham Drew's lot," he said, and drove off to 5 RTR somewhere east of us along the top of the escarpment. He collected about a dozen honeys, formed them up in a solid triangular armored phalanx, and moved off into the desert night. They had a wild Guy Fawkes encounter with an enemy column, but did not get back the brigade HQ. The sun was down behind the rugged western escarpment, and the smoke and dust of war were mingling with the darkness as we strained our eyes into the depression to try and see what was happening. I was quite sure that any minute the squat shapes of panzers would come rumbling through the gloom, but we could see no movement except for the silhouettes of a party of stretcher-bearers walking along the rim of the escarpment to the west, steel-helmeted but incredibly unconcerned. Machine-gun bullets were zipping everywhere through the low scrub, and I used the last of the light to study these courageous men through my binoculars. With the exception of the medical officer who was leading them, they were all colored. "Good Lord," I said to myself, "Cape Collards! That must be the South African Brigade over there." And I saw again that long line of tanks sweeping up from the sunset, and wondered what would happen to the infantrymen crouched in their shadow, rocky slit trenches when the panzers rolled over them. I turned to my CO. "Sir, that brigadier will get a bloody VC for today's performance, but I wish to hell he had waited 10 minutes. He got his VC. It was Brigadier Jock Campbell. That night we loggered where we were, each man sitting in his appointed place inside the turret. I wondered what the hell had happened to Tom Einan. I didn't think about tomorrow at all. Some years later, penned up in England awaiting the invasion of Normandy, I whiled away the time by writing an account of these incredible hours for a Sunday newspaper. My then commanding officer read it in the mess, asked me if it was true, and pointed out that it was very convenient that the only person who could corroborate it, Jock Campbell, was dead. I had come to the conclusion some time before that it was practically impossible for a junior officer to kick a colonel in the backside and get away with it, especially in an officer's mess, so I said nothing. A few days later, a letter arrived for me, and looking quickly at the signature, I was elated to see it was from Tom Einan. I invited him to come and spend a few days with us and went to meet him at Ipswich Station. He came out of the train on crutches and one leg. Back in the mess, he told me his story. He had seen the little staff car alongside me and heard my information going back to the CO, but couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the car tearing off down the escarpment with my tank just behind it. He got a late start, but was soon pursuing the pair of us toward the airfield several hundred yards behind and going flat out. He saw my honey stop, and then the car came jinking back through the shell bursts. He was still wondering what it was all about when he spotted the long line of Jerry tanks coming toward the landing ground. "I was just going to give the driver the order to slow down and pull up in line with you," Tom told me, "when my honey suddenly swung completely around, still going flat out, and we went back across the airfield, lurching crazily from side to side. I thought my driver had gone mad and was yelling at him through the mic when I felt the operator pulling hard on my leg. He shouted up at me that the driver had been hit." Just after this, the tank had come to a halt of its own accord, and they had all clambered out. Shells had been bursting all over the airfield, and the air had been whistling with bullets. Tom had gone round to the front of the tank to try and get the driver out through the hatch. He had propped open the thick steel flap and had reached in with both hands to grip the man under the armpits. The driver had been dead or unconscious, and as Tom had leaned back to heave, he felt the gears engage suddenly, so that the honey lurched forward, bundling Tom over backwards and passing right over him. What had happened, he reckoned, was that the shell had penetrated the front of the tank and killed the driver, whose foot had depressed the clutch pedal and stayed on it until Tom had tried to pull him out. Then his foot had moved, the clutch pedal had sprung out, engaging the gears, and the tank had started forward. "When I came out from under that, honey," said Tom, "I didn't know what the hell had happened for a few seconds. I saw the tank disappearing with my crew hanging onto the side and the corpse in the driver's seat. Then I realized my one leg had been more or less snapped off at the hip. That night the Jerrys picked me up and sent me to one of their hospitals." After nearly 3 years in hospitals and POW camps, Anan had been released under an exchange of prisoners scheme shortly before reading my article. I let him repeat his story to the CO without comment. There was another confirmation, of a sort, at the war's end. Writing of the afternoon's events in the Royal Artillery Commemoration Book, Brigadier Healy described the withdrawal from gun positions on the edge of the airfield. Quote, "The advancing German infantry were almost on them. Firing at point-blank range with apparently no hope of survival, these indomitable men still fought their guns. Suddenly, a troop of British light tanks roared out of the gathering gloom, charged straight into the German infantry, and firing with every weapon they had, halted the enemy attack long enough for the gunners to hook in and pull out." Unquote. It is surprising how radically a slightly different angle can alter the view. Another example of altered perspective is recorded in the Rifle Brigade's account of the proceedings. After referring to the synthetic dust storm caused by charging tanks and bursting shells, the writer describes how Brigadier Campbell came up to a regiment of the 4th Armored Brigade, dashed along the line of tanks hammering on their steel sides, explained the urgency of the situation, and led them into battle in a sort of cavalry charge, waving a red flag. I am not the least surprised that on that confused and bloody battlefield the Brigadier's blue and white flag seemed red, or that 2 honeys could look like a regiment. One other thing about that Sidi Rezeg evening that always puzzled me has been cleared up subsequently by German war diaries. When I last saw that mass of panzers and infantry, they had nearly reached the edge of the airfield. I could never understand why, during the night or at dawn the next day, the whole depression and the escarpments to north and south of it were not overrun and occupied by the enemy. I knew only too well that there was practically nothing to stop their progress across the landing ground except the empty hulks of tanks and the immobile dead. What had stopped them? The explanation from the German side was a simple one. They had run out of petrol and ammunition. Thus, history is made and written. On the following morning, the newspapers of Britain and the Commonwealth had headlined with rejoicing type General Sir Thomas Blamey's comment, "Britain has won the tank battle in Libya." Many times in the years that have passed, I have tried to recapture my personal emotions through the events of that hectic afternoon. At the beginning, it is always the same with me. A turmoil in the stomach, which is probably a common experience, giving physical credence to the expression "wind up." I had had the same feeling many times to a lesser degree, waiting for a race to begin or getting ready to bat in a test match. Then, when the race is begun or the innings started, the fullness of the moment overwhelms the fear of anticipation. It is so in battle. When mind and body are fully occupied, it is surprising how unfrightened you can be. I only remember 2 moments on the airfield when I felt the shock of fear so strongly that it went to my stomach. There was the first realization of the long row of panzers coming straight towards me, and there was the sudden awareness when I looked back over my shoulders, expecting to see the honeys roaring out onto the landing ground, that I was utterly and completely alone. But they were fleeting emotions, soon secondary to the business in hand and the need to sound not afraid to those other 3 men below me. I had to stay in command, not only of them, but of time and circumstance. I was bewildered by the whole situation and, as always, filled with an intense curiosity about what was going to happen next. Running through it all, too, was a sense of elation at what we were doing out there on our own, or trying to do. Also, I was bloody annoyed not with the Germans or Italians, but with the brigadiers and generals and colonels and all the blasted armored brigades and regiments that had left me stranded naked on an airfield within a few hundred yards of a panzer division, while they mucked about in an immunity of confusion. That evening I rolled up in borrowed blankets alongside the adjutant's tank and went to sleep, wondering how the hell we 4 had managed to be still alive.